Now, can you all hear me? Please wait a moment. So next I will speak about how the mind-only school spread. Please wait a moment. So next I will speak about how the mind-only school developed. Now when we talk about how the mind-only school spreads, I thought we should divide it into four different parts. And these four, the first is how the spread of the mind-only in India, the spread of the mind-only in China, the spread of the mind-only in Japan, and then the fourth is the situation of the mind-only school in ancient and modern Tibet. And because if we talk about Tibet, and to say that the text of the mind-only spread, but the school of the mind-only, it's questionable whether the school of the mind-only spread or not. And so I'll speak about the ancient and modern situation of the mind-only in Tibet. And so first I'll speak about the spread of the mind-only in India. And so first of all, the first thing we have to know is, and as I've said many times recently, there's not much of a tradition in India of recording history in writing. And so for all the texts, all the authors, the dates of their birth and death, or even when a particular school develops, when it developed, what changes occurred over time, and so forth. When academics research this, they compare the texts and the histories passed down from previous generations. They compare these all. They examine all the different situations in detail, and then only at that time can they deduce or estimate the dates and so forth. There is otherwise no clear written history. So if we wish to really know what the actual origins of the mind-only school were, the first thing we need to understand is like how the mind-only spread when it originally spread, what sort of form it took at that time. How did it appear? What was the framework or the form of the philosophy at that time? It's important for us to understand that. Now, then the second step is is to see what changes occurred in that original form. How did it develop itself? And how did it become perfected? And in the end, what sort of presentation was finalized? You can see what situations and what circumstances, how did the complete philosophy that we see today develop? So going from the original form until the complete form, there's a sequence of changes. There are stages of change that it went through, and so there's a sequence of the different forms it took. And it's important for us we absolutely have to know the stages of those changes. There are many different ways to determine that sequence of changes, but the best way we have now is we need to read all the texts related to the mind only that we currently see, that we can see with our eyes, that we can hear about. And after we have read them, we need to distinguish the fine differences in between their different thought and to research them. At the very least, we have to see, well, what about the words they use? What terms did they use? What was their terminology? And what grammatical style did they have? What changes occurred in all of those? And in this way, if we can tell not only do we look at the beginning to the end of beginning to the end of a text, we also compare it to other texts. And if we do this, then only then can we see what happened among different texts. We can tell which ones appeared earlier, which ones appeared later. And so then only when we compare them in this way can we have any hope of knowing what order they appeared. But there's another really complicated aspect of Indian history, and what that is when the authors wrote their texts, they didn't write down when they wrote the text. It's written down in Tibetan texts. There are a few where it's not written, but most of them, it is recorded when they're written, which year, which month it's written. But with the Indian texts, the authors didn't write down when they wrote the text. In addition to that, in many texts, the name of the author is itself not even written. And when you don't write down the name of the author, you don't know who actually wrote it. I had one experience, was that in China, the great artists of the past, mostly when they made a painting, signed the painting with their name. They'd write their name. And because they'd signed it with their name, so the art historians can tell who wrote or who drew each painting. In our Tibetan tradition, we aren't allowed to put our own ordinary names on the representations of the body, speech, and mind of the Buddhas. If we do so, that'll weaken our own life, we say. And so we say whether it's a painting or whether a sculpture or whatever, it's not recorded who wrote it or when they did it. And so then several centuries later, if we need to identify a tanka that was painted by a particular great artist, then it's very difficult. And the reason is because it's not clear who actually painted it. So we have to look at the style of painting and sort of guess from that. But we can't categorically say the artist was such and such. In particular, with many texts, the manuscripts were originally the original was in Sanskrit, but it's been many centuries since the Sanskrit originals were lost. So not only is there not a question of not merely not being a manuscript, it's that it has been many hundred years since there have been any manuscripts. In addition, there were different texts that were translated by different translators. And the manuscript is different, and there are some differences in the contents as well. And particularly, sometimes with the different translations, there are big differences in the content. And we have many different translations. So which translation is closest to the original? Which one fits best with the translation, which is close to the translation? It's very difficult to say. In order to do this, it's easy. You can say this if you actually see the original manuscript. But if there's no original manuscript, you only have the translation left. You can only look at the translated text. And if you have two translations, there's no way for us to tell which of them is actually closest to the original. In the very least, even with the translations, they're often translated from different manuscripts. For example, we sometimes had the colophons say this one was translated from a northern Indian transcript, this from an eastern transcript. And so if they had the same manuscript, we could easily tell what it was. Now, another thing that is even more complicated is that sometimes the authors' names appear differently in the different translations. In Chinese, there's a translation of the Ornament of the Mahayana Sutras translated by Prabhakara Mitra. It's probably a commentary on the Ornament of the Mahayana Sutras. No, it's not. It's the verse version of the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras. And what it says is that it was written by a Sangha. But when we look in the Tibetan and other Chinese texts, what's written is that the verses on the Ornament of the Mahayana Sutras are written by Maitreya. Likewise, there's also a prose version of the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras. And this can also be understood as a commentary on the Ornament. You can talk about it as the prose version of the Ornament Sutras or as the commentary, but in any case, in our tenure, this is called an explanation of the Ornament Sutras. And so this explanation of the Ornament of Mahayana Sutras is said in the long commentary by Sthiramanti and by Buddha Rinpoche to have been written by Vasubandu. And so you have different texts that are attributed to different authors. And so there's situations such as this. Likewise, when you have different translations, you have different attributed to different authors. And for these reasons, if we really want to know clearly the development of the mind-only philosophy, we need to compare the contents of the sutras and treatises we currently have and determine their order. We need to see what is similar, what is different. And then we compare them, then we can determine their order. First, we think of what must have been earlier, what must have been later, and establish their order. In other words, and also we furthermore need to search for all the different sources on the related people, on their history. We need to look to see what. And so we need to kind of dig up all the old history and see what events are recorded about that various person, and looking at these. And so then look back at the past history. And then so then in this way, we can bring out the history and see what was the order and what were the situations, what were the order of things that happened. And so in other words, we need to think about things in backwards. We need to go from now backwards to the previous time. So basically, when you talk about so basically, if we're going to talk about the way that we research the mind only in general, so that then generally it's that. But nowadays, there's a tradition, you could say, or there has been research into the mind-only school, and when that began in modern times is at the end of the 19th century. And so at the end of the 19th century, they were so it's at the end of the 19th century that modern research into the Aogachara mind-only school began. And this was conducted by researchers in Japan, Europe, and America. And they began by researching the dates of Vasubandu. And so they began researching when Vasubandu appeared, and then began with that. Then they gradually started to look at when was Masanga, when was Maitreya, and they began to research all of these different questions. And so for the time that the research began until now, it's been a bit over 100 years. It's been a bit over 100 years since the research began. And even though there have been over 100 years that have gone, then actually during that time, if you think how many questions have actually been definitively settled, really there haven't been many. There have been a few that have been definitively settled. There's a certain fair degree that have been definitively settled, but not that many. And since there aren't so many areas that have been really definitively settled, then there have been, but many promising areas have developed in the research. And because of these, then we can think about in terms of the development of the mind-only philosophy and the sequences of the mind-only, we can say that we can have a rough understanding of how this is. And our ability to have that understanding comes from the research that these academics have done. This is, something that we don't know about. The people have been researched for over 100 years, and we haven't paid attention. We don't know about it. We don't understand anything about it. What we do amongst our tevens is we do say that if we do talk about doing modern research with modern methods, there's a great scholar named Kanga Kasungawang. And if we look at his books, now he lives in Japan, and so because he's there, he has great connections with the Japanese scholars. If we look at his books and his writings, you see that he's come to what would be an international level of international standards for the day. Other than that, if we look at whatever text we look at, see that if we come even there are very few who have come to an appropriate international level of research on the mind only, and few have even coming close to this. And so this is an area that we are really left far behind, and this is important for us to remember. Now, when we're explaining the spread of the mind-only school in India, as I explained the other day, the earliest text for explaining the mind-only view that clearly explains it is the Sutra Unraveling the Intent, the Sandiniro Mochana Sutra. There's another text in addition to this Sutra Unraveling the Intent that also appeared in the 1st century, but that is the Mahayana Abhidharma Sutra. However, it seems that the sutra of the Mahayana Abhidharma Sutra was not translated into other language. It wasn't translated into Chinese. It's not translated into Tibetan. We don't have it anymore. And there's no Sanskrit manuscript to be found. And that is quoted in other texts, but other than that, it has been lost. So for that reason, the earliest text that clearly teaches the mind-only view is the Sutra Unraveling the Intent. And it's estimated this appeared sometime not too long after Nagarjuna passed away. This is the estimate. Now, as I mentioned before, the view of awareness only, or the view of mind only developed gradually and is improving over time. Then when I got to a certain time in a certain place, then the framework of the view, the main points of the view were compiled. And because of the completion of that, then the sutra unraveling the intent that we have and can read nowadays was only completed then. So the sutra unraveling the intent occurred when the mind-only view had developed to a certain degree, and it is a text that then compiles all of these the main points of that philosophy. But this is just a text that teaches the mind-only view, but the actual development and spread of the mind-only school happened because of the Bodhisattva Maitreya, Asanga, and Vasubandhu, these three incredible authors of the treatises. And so there are many authors, but among the primary ones are Maitreya, Asanga, and Vasubandhu. It is because of their kindness that the stages of mind-only view were completed and perfected and spread widely to various different areas. And so that is how that occurred. So first of all, we talk about Maitreya, the Bodhisattva Maitreya, the protector Maitreya. We can talk about as the Acharya of the mind only, or the one we talk about Maitreya as one of the founders of the mind only. Now, this is a picture of Maitreya. This is probably a statue from the region of Gandhara. So it's a stone carved statue of Maitreya. When you speak about Maitreya, we always talk about, what do we call him, protector Maitreya? So I'm just going to use that word. If I just say Maitreya only, if I only say Maitreya, it just sounds like just a regular, it's like, hey Maitreya. It seems like kind of disrespectful. So I'm going to say Lord Maitreya, the protector. We'll call him that. So whether protector Maitreya is an actual historical personage, or was he not? Scholars have different positions about this. Now, and there are primarily two different positions. And of these two primary positions, the first of these positions is that the protector Maitreya was not a person who actually appeared in history. And the reason for this is that there was a master Asanga, right? So Acharya Asanga. And at the time of Asanga, Asanga lived in the region of northern India in an environment where people had a great faith and devotion for the Bodhisattva Maitreya. He was born in northern India, and then that region of North India that had great faith and devotion in Bodhisattvas. He was born in that environment. And because of that, because he was in such an atmosphere of faith and devotion for Maitreya, that influenced him strongly. Because he was strongly influenced by that, he considered this Maitreya, from whom he had faith and devotion, as he considered him as guru. Now, when you say consider him as guru, it's like not like following a human guru, but sort of thinking of like there's a Yidam deity. So thinking about it, whether it's thinking about it as guru, thinking about it as a Yidam deity. Now, at that time, they didn't speak about Yidam deities, but if we talk about it the way we speak about it now, it's like he's recognized him as either a Yidam deity or a guru, and recognizing him like that. Asanga himself actually, for the Asanga, said that it was Maitreya who wrote many texts that he actually written. He borrowed Maitreya's name to credit him as the author. And so for that reason, the protector Maitreya is not an actual person who appeared in history, but it's because Asanga had such great faith in Maitreya, and because of that, the name Maitreya appeared, but there wasn't actually in actual history. There was not a human called the protector Maitreya. Now, the second position is that the protector Maitreya was a person who actually appeared in history, and this is a guru whom Asanga had followed. So he was a person with like a body of flesh and blood, a real person that everyone can see in their common perception. So he was an actual historical personage. So we've got there are two positions on whether Maitreya was an actual historical person or not. Now, the basis for the first one is that in ancient India or in ancient China, and also in Tibetan tradition, there are many different sources, textual sources in which it is written that Asanga accomplished dhyana. He practiced dhyana, and first he gained clairvoyance. And because he had the clairvoyance, and because he had the clairvoyance of magical powers, because he had that clairvoyance, he went to the Tushita heaven. This is not a human realm, of course. It's not like he went to America. Instead, he went by miraculous powers to the heavens. And when he went to the heavens, who was in the Tushita heaven? Well, it was a protector Maitreya. As we usually say that before the Buddha Shakyamuni came to Earth, he appointed Maitreya as his regent. And so Asanga went miraculously to Tushita and followed Maitreya as his guru and received much dharma and instructions from Maitreya. So this is the story. This is what we say, right? They say in ancient India, they say it in Tibet, they say it in China. And so if we take that explanation as the basis, Maitreya is like a pure vision, or else here is like an image, a vision that appeared due to Asanga's experiences in dhyana. And so that is the sort of person that he was, but it's not that he was an actual historical personage. Because if you go to the heavens, the realms of the gods and the realms of humans are different, right? And so what Asanga saw himself is not something that ordinary people could see. And so in the common appearances, the shared appearance, it's difficult to say that there is a protector Maitreya, then it's difficult to say, because if there actually were in everyone's common appearance, everyone could see. Asanga wouldn't have to go to the other desert. And if he didn't need to go to the heavens, then there'd be no reason for Asanga to go through such difficulties to practice jhana meditation. And so for that reason, we say that protector Maitreya was a deity. who appeared to, in the pure vision of a Sangha, or that is a vision that appeared to his experiences in jhana, but he was not an actual historical personage. Now, this is an explanation that has a very long historical pedigree. It's not something that people have been saying just for a couple decades. They explained this in India, they explained it in Tibetan, Chinese, it's a tradition that has gone on for well over 1,000 years. There was a scholar in Japan who is specialized in the modern Japanese mind only, whose name was Ui Hakuju. So Ui Hakuju was this Japanese scholar. These Japanese names, Ui Hakuju. Actually, Japanese people, when I hear the names, I don't know if they can understand what I'm saying when I'm saying the name, so I'm going to pretend. I'm going to say Ui Hakuju. So Ui Hakuju, in 1922, and even my parents had been born then. So in 1922, he proposed a hypothesis, and the hypothesis he proposed is that Maitreya was an actual historical personage, he said, someone who appeared in history. And in particular, what he's estimated is that not only did Maitreya actually live in history, but that he must have lived in from 270 to 350 Common Era or thereabouts. That's what he estimated. So once he said that Maitreya, the protector Maitreya is an actual historical person, there's a lot of animated discussion about this among scholars. Some people who agreed, and some people that no, it can't be, who objected to it. And so up to now, they're continuing to debate. They haven't really determined. There hasn't been any consensus even up to now. Some people accepted, some people disagreed, and they refute that. There's no consensus on the issue. And so if I have time later, I will speak about how this debate among the scholars arose, and I'll think about it in a little bit more detail if I have time later. So whether the protector Maitreya was an actual historical person or not, in any case, there are many texts that are said to be written by the protector Maitreya. That's the actual case. And some of these texts, have very similar thought. They're very compatible thought, and so they're very closely related. And so there are some like this. And because there are these, then, because they have a compatible thought and they have a closely related, they're generally accepted to have been written by the protector Maitreya. So now I'll give a few examples of that. So the dharmas of Maitreya that were written by Maitreya, so there's a name that we use for the texts written by by Maitreya. This is called the dharmas of Maitreya. Now, there are two primary different ways of identifying the dharmas of Maitreya. There is the way that takes the text, the five dharmas of Maitreya as according to the Chinese canon, and then also how the five dharmas of Maitreya are identified in the Tibetan tradition. And among these two of them, there are some texts that are the same in those that are that are the same in both of these. Now, the first of these is the Yogacara levels, distinguishing the yoga, the ornamenting the or minor sutras, and the distinguishing the middle from extremes. And so these are accepted as works of Maitreya in both the Chinese and the transit. Now, there is one that is just now. How many? There are two that are. There are the two that are not that are accepted by the Chinese to be a work of Maitreya, but not in the Tibetan tradition. In the Chinese tradition, there is one called the Distinguishing Yoga, and this is but this is not translated. There's the name is recorded in the canon, but it was not actually translated. The second one is the commentary on the Vajrayana Sutta, and this is not in the Chinese canon. Now, there's not even any record in the Tibetan tradition of these texts having been written by Maitreya, but in the Chinese canon, there are these mentions of these two texts being written by Maitreya. Now, there are also two texts in the Tibetan tradition that are attributed to Maitreya in the Tibetan tradition, but not accepted as as in the Chinese companion. The first is the ornament of clear realization. So this is, you all study it when we study Prajna Paramita, we study the ornament of realization. You all know it is very important. And then the second one is the distinguishing the family that chose the Ratnagota Vibhaga or the Sublime Continuum. And so this is a text we'll talk about later. And I'm not sure how long that'll take. No, after I've completed the description of the mind-only, I'll discuss the Sublime Continuum. But it'll take a couple of years before I get to it. It's a very long time to get about. The way I teach things, it's such a long text that if I teach the Mahayana, the Sublime Continuum, then it would take me probably a decade or two to teach it. So perhaps in the future, that I have the hope that I might be able to teach the Sublime Continuum. But in any case, it's the Chinese tradition does not accept that the Sublime Continuum was written by Maitreya, nor do they accept that the ornament of clear realization was by Maitreya. It was not even translated into Chinese in the ancient times. It was only translated recently. But there are the texts that we need to recognize the texts that are accepted as works of Maitreya by both the Chinese and the Tibetan traditions. So the texts that are generally commonly accepted to be works of Janus are the ones that are accepted both by the Tibetan tradition and the Chinese tradition. So these are the ones that contemporary researchers generally accept to be written by Maitreya. Those that are disputed, they don't really accept that they are necessarily written by Maitreya. So among these different texts, among the four texts that are discussed by, there are four that are commonly accepted to be by Maitreya. Now, the first of these is the Yogacara levels, and what we call this in the Tibetan tradition, we credit this to a Sangha. It's not included as one of the five dharmas of Maitreya. And in terms of its contents, the Yogacara levels are different from those of the other dharmas of Maitreya, like the ornament of Mahayana Sutras, distinguishing metal from the extremes and distinguishing Phenomena Dharmata. There are great differences between the two, so there are definite reasons. There are certain reasons why we should question whether or not it was written by Maitreya. So I'd like to begin by giving some examples about the style and usage of terms in these texts. Within the Yogacara levels, excluding the Yogacara levels, there are the three texts that we generally accepted to be actual works of the Maitreya, are the ornament of the sutras, distinguishing middle from extreme, distinguishing the Dharma from the Dharmata. And these terms always use terms called abhuta parikalpa. And what this means is It means the non-originated or the untrue imaginary. And there's a graha grahaka, which means apprehender and apprehended. And there's also pratibhasa abhasa. So pratibhasa abhasa means appearance and self-seeming appearance. And these three terms appear they're used very heavily. They're very frequently used in the ornament of the sutras, distinguishing the metal from extremes and distinguishing the pranama from dharmata. But these three terms do not appear at all in the Yogacara levels. For that reason, there's a big difference between the Yogacara levels and the three other works of dharmas of Maitreya. So for these reasons, many contemporary scholars do not agree that the protector Maitreya could have written the Yogacara levels, because in terms of the contents, there are great differences. For example, there is a Japanese scholar, Hakamaya Noriaki. To explain his opinion, what he says is that the Yogacara levels, when Asanga was in meditation, he had a vision of Maitreya, whom he had greatest faith, and Maitreya taught them to Asanga. Asanga then took them down in notes, and with these notes, then based on these notes, the Yogacara levels appeared in a written form. And so there is a tradition that says, this is what is said in many sources, so he accepts that. Then there is an American Buddhologist, the D.S. Rueg. And so the D.S. Rueg says, in his opinion, there's a big difference here. Asanga had received many instructions from various different previous yogas, and he thought he needed to compile them well. And so while he was working on this project, within his mind, he had this feeling that he had been blessed by Maitreya. You could say that he was blessed, or that he was inspired. It's a file of a deep feeling of being inspired by Maitreya. Because he had such a strong experience that in that condition, he wrote the Yogacara levels. And so for that reason, he says that the Yogacara levels are because of the feeling of being blessed by Maitreya, or because of the inspiration of that. And it was because of that he wrote it. Now, both of these are both based on the premise that Maitreya was not a natural historical person. Because if he was a natural historical person, the situation would have been different. So when we look at these opinions of these two scholars, we'd say that if on the one hand, Asanga received blessings of Maitreya and engaged in the work of composing the Yogacara levels, and from another level, that the actual person who wrote it was Asanga himself. And so they both have these two features. And then there are also many scholars who say that the Yogacara levels, were not written by a single person. They were written by many scholars, or by many people. So many people collaborated to write the Yogacara levels. And so there are many scholars who hold this position. To give an example of them, there is a very well-known, German scholar named Bamberg Schmidhausen. And what he says is that the Yogacara levels were compiled gradually over the course of several generations. He says it couldn't have been written by a certain person. It's not that he had no reason for that. He looked at many different aspects of it. So Yogacara levels was not written in a single generation. It was written over many generations or several generations. And there's one section of it, the Compendium of Austinius, that cites the that's cited in the Ornament of Clearization. It shows that it must have appeared then, which then also cites the Sutra Unraveling the Intent, which therefore must have appeared even later, or it must have appeared even after that. And if we look at most of the sections of the Yogacara levels, such as must have appeared somewhat earlier than the other sections of the Compendium. So the passages from the Compendium of Sermons that were section that were cited in the passage of the Compendium of Sermons that was cited in the Order of the Mahayana Sutras must have appeared later, and the others were probably earlier than the other works of Maitreya. There's also a Japanese scholar, Sukuru Shinjo. And what he holds is that the Yogacara levels were compiled by many people in collaboration. And so the previous is saying that it was compared over many generations. And another scholar says it was also compiled by many people in collaboration. So in brief, it is commonly held among contemporary academics that the Yogacara levels was not written by a single author. They said that there is not a lot of support for the idea that it would have been written by single authors. And so many other people also say that there's reasons to say this, and so this has become a very commonly held position. When we look at the presentations, the logical presentations in the Yogacaras, we see that they're primarily written by practitioners based on their own experience, and we can really have a strong feeling of this. And also, when we look at the contents of the Yogacara, we can see that it must have taken a very long time to complete the work. It was not written in a short period. We can deduce that it must have been written over a long period of time. Generally, academics hold that among the Yogacara levels, some were written earlier, some were written later. So there was a sequence in which they're written. And among them, the earliest, the one that was first written down on paper was the Bodhisattva levels. And so with the Bodhisattva levels, according to some scholars, they spent over 40 years researching the Bodhisattva levels. And when they compared the Bodhisattva levels with the ornament of the sutras, they found great similarities between both the Bodhisattva levels and the ornament of sutras. And so for that reason, these there was a Japanese scholar named Oda Nobuchiyo. And so Oda Nobuchiyo in 1987, what he said in 1987 was that he said that the Bodhisattva levels appeared before the ornament of the sutras, and he gave the reasons and the sources for his postulate. Later, there was an American scholar named Wayman. And so in 1961, Wayman said that there are many there are citations in the Bodhisattva levels of passages from the Ornament of Centuries. So the Bodhisattva levels, it seems like it must have come after the Ornament of the Sutras. But regarding this, the German scholar, the German scholar Schmidhausen, the one who I met before, the Schmidhausen whom I mentioned before, what he said is that in a 1969 publication, there is the word alankara in the name. The ornament is alankara in Sanskrit. It shouldn't be understood as meaning just a it shouldn't be referred to as a special thing. Actually, it was a particular style of writing, actually. So it's actually just a style of writing and not the name of Ashutatis. And so in this way, and so for this reason, he raised an objection to the American academics' idea that because there were citations of the ornament, so that this was in the Bodhisattva levels, that it must have been written, the Bodhisattva levels must have been a written letter. Later, there was the Japanese scholar Odani Nobuchiyo, who took the commentary by Siddhamate on the Ornament of the Sutras. And based on that, what he said is that he said you could determine from this the order of the Bodhisattva levels of the Ornament of the Sutras. And the Bodhisattva levels was earlier, and the Ornament of the Sutras was later. And so from that time until now, among academics, now, there's a general consensus among scholars of the Bodhisattva levels that the Bodhisattva levels was earlier and the Ornament Sutras was later. This is basically everyone's accepting this consensus. So in brief, when we look at the similarities in thought between these two works of the Bodhisattva levels and the Ornament of Sutras, we can see that the thought of the Bodhisattva levels is earlier than that of the Ornament of the Sutras. And we can also see how much development had occurred and how much improvement had occurred in the mind-only view between the two works. We can also see that the Ornament of the Sutras took many different sections and passages of the Yogacara levels as its basis, and then recompiled them, and then after compiling, and then it was written down, compiled in certain form, and we can see this clearly. Now, if, and this is just saying if, now if the Yogacara levels were written by Asanga and the Ornament of the Sutras by Maitreya, then we'd have a big difficulty. And what the problem would be is that their dates would be mixed up, because it's pretty well decided that the Ornament of the Sutras is later. And so if the Yogacara levels are written by Asanga, and that was determined to be earlier, right? So if Asanga wrote the Yogacara levels and Maitreya wrote the Ornament of the Sutras later, then Asanga would have had to have been before Maitreya. Or it'd be the question of whether Maitreya might have used Asanga's work as a basis for writing the Ornament of the Sutras. This is like a new question. And so the big question that comes up is, who wrote the Ornament of the Sutras? Did Maitreya write it, or did Asanga write it? And so there are many different positions about this among academics. And so even to this day, it has not really been determined. But to speak about four particular positions here, the first is by a scholar named Levi. I think he's a German scholar. And what this German scholar says is, In the ornament of clear realization, there's a prose version and a verse version. The verse version is what we have in Tibetan. There's also the prose version that's like a commentary of the ornament of the sutras, and this is in both. It seems it is in Tibetan. It seems to be in Chinese, and he says that both of these were written by a sangha. Then the Japanese scholar Ui Hakuju, he says that the verses were written by Maitreya and the prose version by Asanga. That's what he says. The American scholar Wayman says that Asanga, that the Asanga wrote the verse and proposes that the prose was written by either Asanga or Vasubandu. Then there's a Japanese scholar, Yamaguchi Susumu, and what he says is that the prose was written by Asanga and the verse was written by Vasubandu. So these are really particular positions. Now, there are many different positions, but I'm giving these four as like an illustration. Later, there were two Japanese scholars who did a lot of research into the authorship of the ornament of the sutras. So they did considerable research into the authorship of the ornament of the sutras and the authorship of the Yogacarta levels. And in the end, what they came up with is this opinion. We have a question about whether Maitreya was a historical person, but if he is an actual historical person, that gives a difficulty. Not only does it give many difficulties for us, if the founder of the mind-only school was a founder of the mind-only school and he's a historical person, we'd have to say that he's the founder of the mind-only school. But if he's not a historical person, then we'd have to say that the founder of the mind-only is a sangha. And so what one of the scholars, so these two scholars, one of them says, and so one of the scholars holds that Maitreya is merely a vision that actually appeared to practitioners, people who practice yoga. And when the yogis wrote down what they heard, they didn't write down their own business saying, this is what I think. Instead, because of their jhana meditation, the power that they developed real special powers, special capacities. And because they had this power and what they experience they had from that, they took that as the basis and wrote it down. And they didn't write it taking their own thoughts as the basis. So they're calling the great power that arose from their practice of yoga, that calling the name Maitreya. And if you call it by the name Maitreya, then there's no problem. You can call it Maitreya, that's fine. They call it Maitreya. And so we don't necessarily need to understand Maitreya as being an actual person. The Maitreya is like a power that arises from the power of dhyana meditation. If we give that the name Maitreya, there's no problem with that. So if we think about it in terms of science, contemporary science, if we were to say something like that, then they'd think it's kind of like science fiction, you know? It's kind of like, sometimes it's just an astonishing idea. But the actual point is, the point is, if you think about if you have people who actually have experience and practice, and the experience of those who don't have any practice are not the same. And the experiences that people who practice have cannot be understood by people who don't practice. And in particular, if that person who is practicing the way the person who actually practices understands the actual nature, and the way that people who don't practice understand the actual what's actual fact in nature, they're not the same. because the ordinary people who don't have experience think that everything that appears to our five sensory consciousness actually exists. And when you have yogis who have the appearances that occur, the visions that occur to them because of the yogic perception, then what they see is what becomes actual to them. They say that this is truth. And the people who don't have meditative experience say this is the truth. And so it's very difficult in these terms to say this is true and this is not. But when we're describing who is the author, we're talking about when we're saying that we think that worldly, we think that there has to be an actual person made of flesh and blood who actually was the author of these texts. And that is the basic issue behind the basic issue in the dispute. But if you don't take our common worldly experiences as the basis, then whatever is fine. But if you think about something appears to a Sangha, if we have a vision that appears to a Sangha, like so going to the Tushita heaven and saying, isn't it? But basically the entire situation is completely different. And this is not a situation that can appear to us ordinary people with our common perceptions. If we do not take the common worldly perceptions, then what is under debate is the question of, was there a person who was actually existed historically and in our common historical possessions? If we don't take that as a basis, there's no need to have a debate. So if we want to understand what the connection between Maitreya and Sangha is, then what we first need to have to understand is who was the author of the Ornamental Sutras. But we still do not know who the author of the Ornamental Sutras is. It's been many decades that academics have been recognized, and they're still unable to determine and to establish consensus about who the author of the Ornament of the Sutras was. And so it's not only that, when you think about the other dharmas of Maitreya, there's the distinguishing phenomena in the Dharmata. So who the author of this and when it was written, there's a Japanese scholar who wrote about this, and his name was Hakamai Noriaki. And what he says is that the distinguishing phenomena in the Dharmata was probably not by Maitreya. Instead, it was probably compiled by later disciples. So this is his opinion. And there are quite a few Japanese scholars who support this position. And the reason why this assertion came about is it comes down to in the distinguishing phenomena in Dharmata, there is a proof of the view of transformation. And this term, the view of the transformation, does not appear in any other Dharma of Maitreya. And so for this reason, it must have been later. But we don't need to speak about this topic much more. In any case, many academics have done a lot of research and written quite a few papers. So now more than a few scholars hold the distinguishing phenomenon in Dharmata was work that appeared later. And they basically do not accept that it was written by Maitreya. So in brief, to the end, the last thing to speak about today is to give a little bit of a summary of the research of Maitreya. If we don't have a summary, then it's not a good, if we don't have a summary, then it's hard to keep it in mind. I spoke about so many details, and otherwise you're going to fall asleep. If I was someone who was listening, I'd be falling asleep, but I'm the teacher, so I can't fall asleep. I don't even feel like sleeping. I wanted to sleep, I couldn't. So to give a summary of this, the first summary is that, the point of the summary is that whether the protector Maitreya was a historical person or not is still not known. The second is a question of whether the author of the Yogacara levels of Maitreya or Sangha is still disputed. The third is that within the Yogacara levels, there is the Bodhisattva levels. And this must have been earlier than the ornament of the sutras. Now, this has been established. The fourth is that if the Yogacara levels are by Asanga and the ornament the clear letters are by Maitreya, then how can you do this? So this brings up a question because the orders, the time is mixed up. The fifth is that many contemporary academics, I'm not sure. Hang on a moment. I need to change this. Oh, what happened? So what many contemporary academics say is that the Yogacara levels were not written by a single author. Many say that it was written by several people in collaboration. The sixth is that the debate about who the author of the ornament of the sutras was. And so at this point, there are the four particular ones that I mentioned before. And the seventh point is that many academics hold that the distinguishing phenomenon Dharmata was a later work and it was not written by Maitreya. So those are that's a summary, and I thought it was good for you to know that. So that is our topic for today. So now we will have our dedication prayers.